Why does India Ratings believe that NBFC's borrowings could get skewed towards banks in FY23? For answers to all this and much more, stay tuned to the Expert Lounge, a podcast brought to you by India Ratings and Research, a Fitch Group company. Because ultimately, for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us. Hi, I'm Siddharth Rego and welcome to the Expert Lounge. In today's podcast, I'm joined by Pankaj Naik, director at India Ratings, who has recently authored a report on the NBFC space and the increase in their funding costs. Pankaj, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hey, hi Siddharth, thanks.
Right. So, Pankaj, let's just deep dive into today's topic. Starting off, let's look at the impact, Pankaj, impact of the on the funding mix, given the fact that interest rates are just rising.
Yeah, so we all know that after the RBI raised the repo rate by 90 basis points, the rates in the capital market have shot up. And NBFCs have a material amount of funding coming from the capital markets.
Right.
But an equal amount of funding also gets sourced from banks. Now, we believe that given the rise in rates in the capital markets, NBFCs funding will get skewed slightly towards banks because even though banks also have got floating rate of funds where the benchmark is MCLR or repo or T-bill, but the increase in the rate where it is MCLR linked is slightly with a lag, and that's why NBFCs would prefer going to banks for their incremental funding rather than as compared to capital markets.
Right. Interesting, Pankaj. But I mean, if I have to purely look at it, what would be the quantum of increase in the funding cost for these NBFCs?
Right. So NBFCs typically, in our view, would see an increase in the funding cost to the extent of 90 to 100 basis points.
Okay.
And this will be despite of other measures that they would be taking, like increasing slightly the CP borrowings going up onto the liability side of the balance sheet, liquidity buffers slightly getting diluted.
Right.
Despite all these efforts, I think 90 to 100 basis points is the increase in the funding cost that we expect for NBFCs.
Interesting. So 90 to 100 basis points, that's what could change. Right. And given the backdrop of all of this, Pankaj, what is our stance as far as the liquidity of these NBFCs are concerned, and how will they manage this?
Yeah, so NBFCs typically carried surplus liquidity during the pandemic hit environment, and this was basically to take care of any exigencies, any credit events, the disruption in the market. So take care of all of that. 5 to 10% of the balance sheet was the liquidity available with NBFCs. But now when we see increase in rates, operating environment improving because we have left the pandemic behind, I think NBFCs will now slightly dilute the liquidity buffers on their balance sheet because these buffers come with a negative carry which affect the PNL. So I think for FY23, there will be some dilution on the liquidity buffers as far as NBFCs are concerned.
Yeah, just linking in this to what you just said, Pankaj, what would be the impact then on the profitability of these NBFCs?
Right. So see, cost of funding definitely will go up. Smaller NBFCs will see a slightly higher increase in their cost of funding because as larger and larger NBFCs go to banks for their borrowing requirements, small NBFCs will face some kind of a crowding out.
Right.
But good thing is the credit cost will get moderated because credit costs actually did increase significantly during FY21 and FY22 because of the pandemic. But now for FY23, there will be some moderation in the credit cost. So whatever increase that we see on the funding cost side, that will to some extent get compensated because of a drop on the credit cost. So more or less on the profitability front, it will be a stable profitability year for NBFCs.
Right. So just to sum up, the key takeaways for our listeners, and this is what I could extract from what you articulated just now, is first that the borrowings of NBFCs firstly could get skewed towards banks in FY23, given the hardening interest rates within the capital markets. And on account of this, the small NBFCs could witness a sharp increase in their funding costs as the sectors move towards these banks for meeting its funding requirements. That is the main key takeaway. And the other point is that NBFCs would dilute the liquidity buffers to a certain extent to reduce that impact of this negative carry with the improvement in the operating environment, as well as at the same time the increasing funding costs. But of course, I think our assessment is that NBFCs would be fairly prudent in maintaining those liquidity buffers.
Right. So as we speak to our issuers, we clearly understand that they are still mindful about the sanctity of the asset liability management,
Right.
And also they are going to manage liquidity very prudently. Increase in the short-term borrowing or reduction in the liquidity buffers will not be to an extent that the ALM goes for a toss.
Understood.
So they will be very mindful of that.
Right. Fair point, Pankaj, and thanks for putting things into perspectives. In case our listeners are interested in gaining a deeper insight into what Pankaj just spoke about, you can please check out the report which he's authored. The link to that article and report is given along with the podcast, so do have a look at it. Thank you, Pankaj, and we look forward to seeing you on the podcast again.
Thanks, Siddharth.
And in the meanwhile, do stay tuned to the Expert Lounge. It's a podcast brought to you by India Ratings and Research, a Fitch Group company, because for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us.